Good afternoon. Hope everyone just had some coffee. Yeah? So I'm going to talk about EdReady, which is something I actually talked about last year at this meeting in Vancouver when we had just received some funding for it from the Gates Foundation. Kind of give a preview of what's going on. So now I can tell you where we are, some early data that are coming out of it. The focus of the talk is not so much as an EdReady demo. It's really on some of the sort of principles we think EdReady can start pushing forward for the field, and kind of some of the things I'm hoping people in this room get excited about, start talking to me about, which means I'm going to go through this sort of demo part of it really fast. So if you have questions about some of the nuances and the details of the design, you're going to have to find me later. Otherwise, I won't get this done in the 20 minutes or whatever I've got. So since there's a lot of unfamiliar faces here, very briefly, the NROC project is also known as MITEI, or the Monterey Institute of Technology and Education. We're a nonprofit. We're over 10 years old now, and best known for sort of our collaborative development and discovery of open educational resources, particularly for math, that we then distribute to the world through, we distribute to the world through sites called Hippocampus, which some of you may have heard of. I'll point to that in a second. But we're sustained on the basis of institutional memberships. So what that means is that it might be whole state DOEs, school systems, individual colleges and universities, that sort of thing, who basically sustain our membership organization, become part and parcel of sort of the collaborative development process of what do you need? And then we bring basically the content creation expertise, right, the editorial expertise, the technical expertise to bear to build really excellent, especially high quality multimedia material. And so our reach at this point is pretty well national, and this is one channel by which a lot of our material gets into classrooms, is direct through these relationships we have with institutions. As I said, though, we also have a site called Hippocampus where we redistribute everything to everyone for free, and we're now developing another channel, which is what I'm going to talk about, called EdReady. I also want to point out that we are just now in the process of building an entire NROC developmental English program. You'll see there's a kind of core area of focus which explains why EdReady starts focusing developmental ed. We have a lot of media cutting across algebra and the entirety of the developmental math sequence, and will include developmental English, so it'll become fairly comprehensive in about a year and a half from now. All right, so EdReady. EdReady at its heart is a personalization system. That's what it's built for. And it has a number of interesting properties that we're excited about that I'll try to walk through here. To focus it, though, we're focusing on this developmental ed problem. So for people who don't quite know what that means, developmental education refers explicitly to those students who, by all other metrics, appear to be ready to start college, but whom we then determine really don't actually appear to be ready to start college. Usually they take a placement exam, or there's some other metric that gets brought up where you say, okay, well, you may have graduated from high school, you may have taken the courses that you should have taken, but you don't actually know this stuff very well. And the worry is if you just shove them into college that they'll fail. And historically, that's in fact what they do. They end up failing and dropping out. And so the idea is that you prepare them instead. You say, okay, before you start college, you got to take this developmental ed class, get up to speed, now you can get going. Well, that turns out to be a pretty bad solution. Nationally, almost 50% of people who are entering college, many of whom are now adults returning to college, are being placed into remedial education or developmental education. And most of them don't get through it. So if it's a solution to a problem, it's a solution that's not working. And so we're trying to do something different. Quick walkthrough on what EdReady is. So this would be an experience for an EdReady user. We're going to push EdReady out in two ways. It's a cloud-based service. There's going to be a public version. It'll be national in scope. Any student anywhere can use it at any time for free. We will also, through our membership network, be building custom versions of EdReady for every single institution that wants one. And the customization happens on a number of different levels. Under the hood, everything's kind of running the same way. But what you see here, in terms of the text on, say, the landing page that a student would navigate to, all of that can be customized. So we can get co-branding, we can speak explicitly to that student population, to what that school offers, so on and so forth. there's a number of other points of customization that I'll talk through as we get through. A student who would arrive would sign up. Signing up is free, it's simple. We can also do sign up through single sign-on integration. If you have a student information system or LMS where you like to manage your student population. One of the options students can then have is to start thinking about, if we're, say, a high school student or somebody who's thinking about college, well, where do you want to go? What this is getting at is that it turns out readiness is not an objective construct. What one school considers to be ready, another does not. And it's not just a straight like, oh, here you need to know 80% of the stuff and here you need to know 60. The actual underlying expectations in terms of the knowledge base will vary from place to place. And so for students, this is entirely mystifying. For them, they go through school in their lives, they get to the end of high school, they're like, great, I'm now college ready, right? That's what the national sort of consensus is about what high school is supposed to, high school graduation is supposed to mean. And then they discover, no, actually, not only might you not be college ready, but it really actually depends where you want to go. Some places yes, some places no. It's a big mystery. And so this really derails a lot of plans. And so we get students to start thinking about, well, where do you want to go? We can customize this list. You can see this is customized for sort of a Utah-centric view, so that students can kind of be learning about institutions in their area, for example. We're going to tap into a number of different, especially federal and state databases that can help the students understand what are these schools, why would I go there, and that sort of thing. In the end, though, all of this is really just to get the student into the headspace that what EdReady is going to do is help them figure out if they're ready or not for the things they actually want to do in their lives, right? So we're getting away from the generic black box, go take a placement exam, and then we'll figure it out for you. Now let's figure out what you really want to do. And we're going to be able to make this customization down to program levels, specific career tracks, things like that. So we're trying to put this back in front of the student, like where do you actually want to go? Okay, now that we know that, let's figure out where you are and that sort of path to being ready for that. Whatever the context is they set, they will eventually then land on a page where they have to choose some kind of a diagnostic. These are all completely customizable as well. So we have on the back end a full developmental math curriculum for college math readiness. That basically runs from very basic arithmetic right on through to advanced topics in trigonometry and algebra. And we can customize that in any number of ways. So you can keep it comprehensive, or for example, in the state of Utah, they've actually divided up their math curriculum through the high school grades into these sort of 3 tracks. And so we can customize it for those 3 tracks as well. The point being that, as you probably all know, notwithstanding the Common Core, states have different ideas about what it is people need to know to graduate from high school and be ready for college. And so all we're saying is, well, we've built a system that really doesn't care if they're different. We'll handle it. We'll throw it out. Upon choosing one of these things, we do ask a student to go through and take an initial expedited diagnostic, which then gives us a picture of their readiness sort of profile, if you will, across that diagnostic. And we quickly break it down. So this is sort of the unit structure of that particular diagnostic. And it shows the student that although they get this kind of score here of a 47, that 47 doesn't mean anything. We did that intentionally. Is a 47 a good score? Is it a bad score? Students don't know, and we don't want them to know yet. We're trying to take what appears to the students to be a really big monolithic problem and say, let's break it down. Let's segregate it into its component parts. And we do that by showing them that actually you can treat this as a set, sort of a series of micro activities, unit by unit, where we can figure out for each one of these whether you need to review it, whether you're really not ready, or whether in fact it looks like you might already know it. Having that information in hand, we then present them with the choices that they made at the beginning. So these are the schools they indicated an interest in. And again, I'm racing through this, but some of these schools, it turns out that 47, based on what the schools say, is probably good enough. So right away, we're telling the student, okay, based on what we already know, for some of these schools, you could probably go and not end up being in developmental ed. For other schools, though, these schools here, those scores are 60, 75, 90, you're not ready. If you intend to get to these schools, assuming you can get in, you've got some work to do. And they're not the same, right? Getting your 47 to a 60 is not the same as getting your 47 to a 90. And so in this case, the student decides, well, I think I'm going to see if I can get into southern Utah. that looks like a reasonable distance, about 30 hours of study according to the system, and now we present them with a personalized study plan. So what this is the student score, 47, the target score of 60, and then laid out between the two, like little stepping stones, one to the other, are the units that EdReady has figured out this student needs to master to get that 47 to a 60 and actually be ready for Southern Utah. And we open the first unit, ratios, rates, proportions. It itself is decomposed into a set of topics. We can do micro-assessments on those topics to see whether they really need to study them. And the student is free at this point to click on View Resources. And because these resources, which happen to be our own developmental math resources, are open and available immediately digitally, they'll just pop right up. The student can use them as much or as little as they like. Hopefully they learn the material. I'm going to come back to some of these slides in a second. And upon learning it, they can check their mastery, watch their score rise as they master material and sort of populate this mastery list. And as their score rises, they'll move closer and closer to the target till they hit it. And at this point, we would say this student is ready to go. This student appears to have mastered the material that they are expected to know for that university across this assessment. All right, so I sort of blasted through that. So what are some of the interesting characteristics about this that are germane to the title of the talk? Well, you'll notice back here, I'll stop here, that we have a diagnostic in place that drives the study plan. With the study plan in hand, we're basically telling the student, we know what you don't know. And because we know that, we can use it to push you to the resources that you actually need in a very precise way. What are those resources? Well, they can actually be whatever we want them to be. So we certainly have our own NROC developmental math resources, but the plan is to ultimately have it be a wide and growing marketplace of resources from all over the place, from other providers anywhere that they might be. So we'll certainly be including certain things that we already have relationships with, like Khan Academy, likely CK12. James Sousa's here, who has produced this incredible body of video resources for math. Those will be included. The vision is that if it's good and it's appropriate for referral in this way, we'll take it. We are not delimited to just OER, but it certainly makes a whole lot of sense for it to be OER from a student experience. The last thing a student probably wants to encounter is they click on that resource and it says, give us $5 and you can check it out. Maybe they want to do that. I don't know. This is part of sort of the ecosystem that we're now building as we look at it, where we can start to really see the proof in the pudding on in the end, if you had what appear to be roughly equivalent resources in terms of the task before you, will students go for the free stuff? What are the metrics by which they would be driven that way, as opposed to something that's for fee? Schools, for their own custom versions, can tell us what they want. So we can drop in textbook, for example, correlations to textbooks by chapters and section. If a school's already adopted, or maybe a whole state's adopted a set of resources they kind of want their students to use, or maybe it's a math department, these are all possible things that we can drop into custom versions. So in our head, we're saying what we're really building here is a system that can actually drive these things into use, right? We may actually finally have a wedge where if somebody builds something they think is worth a damn, why don't we drop it in? We'll probably see usage, and now we can start to get some feedback on whether or not it's really working or not. Is it really better than this other thing? What is it about it that attracts students? What is it about it that turns students away? The other thing about this that's pretty exciting is that there's a lot of use cases in which this is already being piloted. So where we are, we started piloting in June. So we had beta code that was sufficient at that point to do it. We are going to wrap up our code development this year, so relatively soon, and we're going to push it out as a version 1 in March of 2014. So we're pretty far along, and we already have some pretty good data. And we've mostly been exploring all the different use cases people are excited about. So we have a number of pilots with four-year post-secondary institutions. They're using it for a whole variety of ways of checking prior knowledge, for making sure that students who have been sort of deemed remedial, if you will, have an opportunity to avoid that fate. Lots of work with community and technical colleges. They're open enrollment. developmental ed is a huge problem for our two-year institutions. High schools, alternative education, this whole question of what do you need for high school graduation, what do you need to be college ready, the two are not actually meeting. They're trying very hard to get these two things to be the same thing, but every time you raise it, more people don't graduate from high school, right? Every time you make it farther away, high school graduation becomes a meaningless metric. Big challenge. EdReady can kind of slip in there as a way of reconciling some of these differences. And a lot of work with adult learning centers also focused on workforce development and so on. And so the point about this is, at least based on this early interest, we think EdReady may turn out to be a really key vehicle for really bringing kind of a personalization frame using this technology all the way across the sector from middle school right on into college. And so as such, it would then become a key vehicle for driving, again, interesting resources into these systems, putting them in play, seeing how they do, seeing what happens. We've been piloting in these states thus far. You can see there's a great diversity. These are all individual pilot versions that we've set up. And I want to just share some very early data on how we're seeing in terms of outcomes. So this is a pilot with a four-year institution. These are students that were going to have to go to a remedial education class before they could start their first math course in this school. And they were given the opportunity to use EdReady. Again, this is a beta version. So it was capable, but certainly not done. And if they completed the assessment, basically the sort of course of study that was set before them, which meant they had to hit this 90, they would then be entitled to retake the placement exam. And if they retook it and did well enough, they could then pass right out of those developmental ed courses. And what we saw was other students who came in, most of them started off ending up around 40 on the diagnostic. Most of them hit or exceeded that target score. This was a summer pilot, 6 weeks. Students did this pretty quickly. And you can't really see that, but there's basically all these various data reports that you can use as an administrator, as a teacher, to evaluate progress, see who's doing what, how quickly are they moving. We also show information that breaks down their unit by unit proficiency in a way that allows teachers to make some decisions about, oh, well, who should I be working with individually? Who should I be working with kind of at a class level? I'll quickly summarize these data. The orange bars here basically indicate that students reached that 90 target score. If they're here, here, or here, when they retook that placement exam, they improved their score by one or more of the benchmarks. One benchmark was all that was required to pass out of remediation. So it worked out so that 90% of the students who hit that score ended up passing out of remediation entirely. We ran a quick kind of back of the envelope calculation of what that meant to these students. This was just 40 students. That was about $30,000 that these students did not spend on non-credit bearing courses in higher ed. They just avoided that fate entirely. And we're tracking them to see if they perform well now in their regular credit bearing courses. We're of course hoping they do. There's a lot of variables there that can affect that, but that's where we are. So why am I even going into these sorts of data? Because I think these are the kinds of data that we all wish we could get out of systems in which you would start deploying OER, right? If you're pushing new and innovative resources and new innovative practices, wouldn't you love to know whether it's actually doing something useful in a way that everyone can see and share? And so these data are going to be piped out essentially through kind of a researcher's portal, anonymized to the degree that we need to. If you're an institution, you get all the data, right? That's part of the privilege of having your own custom version. If students are using your version of EdReady, then you get all the data. The data are always owned by the student, so we're all custodians of the data. If the student doesn't want us to have it, they can just delete it. These data, by the way, show kind of a relationship between the amount of time spent studying resources and then how much score, sort of how much they were able to improve their knowledge. What I like about this graph is it starts to reveal some of the diversity in the student population. So it's clearly not linear. It's actually a log relationship. But there's a certain pool of students that kind of come in and dabble, and they don't do much. And we actually heard from a lot of these students. They kind of dabbled. It was the summer. They had jobs. They had trips, whatever. They ended up deciding, forget it. I'll just take the Dev Ed class. That in and of itself is huge. If any of you have familiarity with developmental ed, part of the problem is that most of the students don't think they belong there. right? They show up and they're, what do you mean I have to be in this non-credit bearing class? Forget this. And that's probably a big part of why they fail. In this case, though, they're getting this independent confirmation that, you really don't know this stuff, right? You are not prepared for the college level course, and now they're getting that. And they're actually actively selecting themselves into these courses. And so the teachers are saying, yay, we're getting students that get it. They know why they're here and they're ready to actually figure this out. Out here, we have students who are incredibly motivated. These are students, this is minutes, but still, by the time you're getting out to 4,000, 5,000 minutes, right, we're talking many, many, many hours of study. They're making progress, sure, but it's really slow. And I would say these are students who clearly need other supports. They probably need a tutor. They probably need more focused instruction. They need something. They might get there eventually, but it's slow. Most students, they're in this space. And there is actually a very tight correlation within students that are not at zero, but kind of right up to around the sort of 1,000, 1,200 minute space. And they move breathtakingly fast. We're talking about something that we would have asked these students to sit down for a whole semester to make up this presumed deficit, and they're getting it done in 12 hours, 16 hours, that kind of thing. It really demonstrates that the systems that we have right now are really inappropriate for what these students really need, which usually is some kind of a refresher, something that really hones in on the problem and gets them where they need to go as fast as possible. That's it in terms of slides. I won't bother going into some of the other data. So why do I call it pulling OER into the classroom? Hopefully it's clear that from where we stand as an organization, a membership organization with institutions, we have a reach into about a third of the institutions in the United States. And we're going to be distributing this and pushing it out as vastly as we can through the internet. And so we think we have a system that is poised to really be omnipresent, to really be in classrooms, in high school, in college, and in many programs in between. And so the question before us now is, great, what do we want to shove through this system and really put in play in a significant way at scale across the country? So if you think about this as providing almost a publication spec, right? Build resources that this can refer students to that make sense to the students who are using it, right? They should land there and go, yes, this is exactly what I need to learn. And then they can start learning it. We would love to suck those up and push them through and work with you all to evaluate when are they getting used, how well are they getting used, are they producing the outcomes we expect. If they're OER, we can take all those data and turn them into actionable data. Let's make it better. If we see all the places where they're falling down, let's make it better. Thank you. Any time for any questions? Yes.
So you mentioned middle school to college. How would you see this working in a 7th, 8th, 9th grade scenario?
So there's a lot of ideas. I can tell you what our pilots have done so far.
Yeah.
So the pilots that we've run at sort of in that middle school level, they're learning this stuff for the first time. So they're certainly not remedial by any means. In fact, some of them were sort of advanced students. And the way they were using it was, one, it was a way of really just bringing digital media into a classroom, which they otherwise struggled with, and this simplified that problem. But the other is they can use it as sort of a benchmarking tool. So students can march along, and then you say, okay, well, I would presume since we spent 4 weeks on this, everybody's got it, I'm going to move on. What teachers know is frequently that turns out to be untrue. A lot of students may have done even reasonably well up to that point, but don't really retain it. And then they're struggling the rest of the time. And they're not sure why. Is it because you don't understand the new material, or is it because you never really mastered the old material? And so you can sort of fire up EdReady at that point and say, can you do a self-check on whether you really learned all that stuff we've already covered? And if there are any gaps that are discovered, EdReady will go ahead and fill them, given what they need to get themselves back up to speed, so you're not leaving anyone behind. That's been the dominant use case. Yes?
I have a friend that talked to me about creating something similar for medical school students for, sending in their applications and stuff like that, because it's a lot of money, and if they don't know beforehand what type of student they may be looking for, they may be wasting a lot of money. And so it could save a lot of money as well.
Yes. So as I said, we're starting in math. There will be developmental English incorporated next year. The platform itself is pretty agnostic to the discipline and to the purpose. So certainly one of my visions, and I've already talked to some people here, I mean, we see it being really great for any STEM discipline, but also foreign language learning, a lot of the social sciences. It's really, you have to sort of imagine any situation where you can say, you know, I think all of these students that I'm about to receive or I have in front of me ought to have this knowledge by this time. If you can describe that as an assessment, you can use EdReady. That's really kind of the simplicity of it. Is it literally boils down to that.
How about international? You roll out international?
So I'm very excited to see where this goes internationally. Our resource base right now can really only keep us focused on kind of a national problem, but we're totally happy to partner with people and have them take the platform and see whether they can get it in play in an international setting.
Or U.S. territories?
Yeah, U.S. territories would be fine. That's within the scope of our coverage. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.